think, I hope you can hear and see me well, right?
We do.
Okay, so let us look at curative expressions in Nakh-Daghestanian languages, also known as East Caucasian languages. I should say from the start that in general, the curative domain is not strongly grammaticalized in the languages of the family. We don't always find dedicated curative markers, although sometimes we do. This domain is not very poor. Here I can mention already that there is a clear asymmetry between caritives and commutatives in Nakh-Daghestanian languages, because we find more or less frequently commutative clitics or even dedicated commutative cases. Sometimes commutative meaning can be expressed by a non-dedicated case, for example, the ablative case. However, we don't have any caritive cases in Nakh-Daghestanian, and at least I'm not aware of any instances when the curative meaning is expressed by a non-dedicated case form. Okay, but still I will give you an overview in this talk of the morphosyntactic strategies and means of expression of the curative meaning. Of course, I will not mention all the languages of the family. I will concentrate on those languages which I'm familiar more, especially the Avar-Endic languages and the Lesgic languages. However, there is a more comprehensive overview of the curative expressions in Nakh-Daghestanian, which is in preparation now by Anastasia Panova, and hopefully this overview will be available online soon as part of the typological atlas of Dagestan. Okay, I will distinguish between three main types of curative encoding in Nakh-Daghestanian: Clausal, Affixal, or more precisely Suffixal, and phrasal. Of course, sometimes one language can have more than one type. Let us start with Clausal curative constructions. These are constructions with a subordinate clause headed by a negative verb form. The verb is usually an existential verb or a copula, a general copula, which also functions as an existential verb, or sometimes a verb with a locative semantics. Probably this type is the most common way of expressing curative meaning in the languages of the family. It exists in almost all languages of the family. I'm not sure whether it exists in every language, but at least in many of them. There are two main subtypes. The head of the subordinate clause can be a participle. In this case, the clause functions as an adnominal modifier, or it can be a converb. In this case, the subordinate clause functions as a clause-level adverbial. Let us look at some simple examples from Avar. These examples illustrate the participial subtype. So, hornless goat will be literally horn not having goat, tasteless food, taste not having food, dishonest person, honor or honesty not having man, but this verb, hecheb or hecho with a gender agreement marker in the end is a participial form of a negative copula. This is not the verb to have. There are now have verbs in Nakh-Daghestanian. This is the negative copula or a negative existential verb. So this is how these meanings are most typically expressed in Avar. And here are two examples of a converbial clause. Don't start without us, literally, we not having or we not being, don't begin. He's lying shamelessly, literally, he tells lies. Well, shame or morality, this is a very abstract word. Not having, again. So, as you may guess, both these types, the participial type and the converbal type, are in fact relativized or respectively adverbialized predicative, possessive, or locative constructions. This negative existential verb, or it is often called a negative copula hecho in avar, is used in finite clauses like those shown here in 6 and 7. I don't have money, the father is not at home, in possessive and locative clauses. And so subordinate clauses with this verb, in particular, express curative semantics. Not having something or someone. As I said, there are no dedicated have verbs in Nakh-Daghestanian, so predicative possession and hence curative relation is expressed by constructions with existential verbs, copulas, or locative verbs. In avar, we see just one very general existential verb, but in some languages there are several verbs, several predicates that can function in this domain, in the domain of possession and location, and there are correspondingly, there may be several curative constructions, which I will illustrate with these examples from Agul. This is a Lesgic language from another branch of Nakh-Daghestanian. So in Agul, there are two main verbs which express possessive relations in predicative possessive constructions. Both verbs include locative prefixes. So the verb kha with the prefix post expresses more or less permanent possession, the verb fa, temporary possession. And here we see this, what I call clausal curative constructions with these two verbs. In 8, we see the verb fa without the oxen, literally oxen not having with you, fadawai. In 9 we have, in 9 and 10 we have the other verb, ha. In 9 this is converbial clause, without you, literally you not having. And in 10 we have participial clause, motherless child is literally mother not having child. But again, what I translate as not having is not a form of the verb to have, but a form of a locative, of originally locative verb, which is used to express possession in Agul. And of course, there can be more verbs like that, depending on the possessive relation or some locative configuration. For example, not having something on or not having something under, and so on. Then in principle, other verbs with other locative prefixes can be used. Okay, here I can show again the asymmetry, but also to some extent the symmetry between caritives and commutatives, because Agul is one of the languages which has a commutative case in Khai, and the original construction, the underlying construction for this case, is symmetrical to the caritive construction. Khai is an affirmative converb of the verb to be at. And so you see in 11 the use of this converb. Literally, this is father was with the sheep, at the sheep, okay? And this converb became the suffix of the commutative case. In 12, we see the commutative form, wa khai. Khai here is just a suffix added to the oblique stem of the pronoun. So there is a commutative case, but there is no curative case. The negative converb, which is used in these clausal curative constructions, has not become, at least so far, a case form. There is a certain descriptive or maybe theoretical problem with these clausal constructions. Some authors don't describe them as clausal, but rather describe these converbs of copulars or locative verbs as postpositions. For example, Hespelmath in his Lesgian grammar, Lesgian is a language very closely related to Agul, and the situation there is very similar to the one we see in Agul. Hespelmath describes commutative postpositions, which are identical to converbs of the two locative verbs. And he also mentions that the notion without is expressed by the negative forms of these expressions. And so probably that means that he treats these negative commutative negative forms, galachis, guachis, which express curative meaning, as postpositions as well. And he glosses them correspondingly, like in example 13, without glasses. Although structurally it is the same as corresponding clausal constructions in Agul. Guachis is a negative converb. Also, I can mention Diana Forker's description of Hinuk. This is a Cesic language from another branch of the family. She identifies the curative marker, which she describes as a postposition, although she mentions that it is in fact a resultative participle, or maybe it is also used as a converb. In any case, although it is formally identical to a non-finite form of the verb be, she prefers to describe it as a postposition. And another similar case is found in the Andi grammar by Salimov, who mentions a negative particle sub, giving an example in 15. Mesub, dunyal, mutlisub, bichin, a world without you, a mountainside without sun. So this sub expresses the meaning without. However, in principle, sub is the participial form of the negative copula. So again, structurally, these two clauses, a world without you and so on, is structurally, it is identical to those clausal constructions which we saw in Avar, for example, where we saw a participle of the negative copula. So I mentioned this to highlight the point that it may be not obvious for different authors whether one should draw a boundary and how exactly one will qualify a certain construction or a certain marker as a subordinate clause, as a postposition, or maybe even a particle, maybe even a suffix, and so on. Okay, let us now briefly talk about derivational curatives. In some languages, there are derivational suffixes, only suffixes, no prefixes, which derive adjectives or sometimes adverbs with curative meaning. You can see an example here from Bagvalal, an Andic language. The suffix is tub with a gender agreeing slot in the end, which is typical for adjectives, and it derives adjectives from oblique stems of nouns. Childless from child, tailless from tail, ugly from look, appearance, and so on. There is also a derivational suffix with a curative meaning in Patsbi, a Nakh language, which derives adverbs, for example, also from oblique stems of nouns, for example, without money, without father, also from pronouns like without me. The adjectives can be also derived from these adverbs. This is probably the only case I am aware of when some suffixal form is described as a nominal case form. So Desherief calls this лишительный падеж. However, other researchers describe this suffix as a derivational suffix, not as a case. There is also a marker nut, a curative marker nut in UD, another Lesgic language. This marker is interesting in that besides deriving adjectives from nouns, it can be also used with some verb forms. For example, with the perfective converb, there are several negation markers in UD, and this marker is the most restricted one with verbs, I mean. However, it is this marker that derives negative perfective converbs in UD. Also in UD, there is a functionally equivalent curative marker sus, obviously borrowed from Azeri, a Turkic language. This marker is even more common in the modern language than the native marker nut. You can see some examples here. I will return to this marker a bit later. In general, in the Lesgic languages, which is the southern branch of the family, we often find this Azeri curative suffix sus or sis, but usually it is not as common as in UD. It is usually more restricted to loan words. We see some examples here from Rutul. So these are typical words that have this curative marker in borrowed words. There is, again, a problem here with derivational markers, which I would like to draw your attention to. In some languages, there are derivational suffixes which seem to have curative meaning, but I'm not sure they are real caritives. For example, in Navarre, there is a curative suffix k, which derives adverbs that denote absence or shortage of some quality of a noun. And here we can see more examples. From these adverbs, adjectives and verbs can be also derived. But although in some examples, in many examples from grammars, such derivatives can be translated as without something, the suffix seems to mean without much something. It seems to imply the lack of considerable degree of something. For example, tzamuk is not without salt at all, but without much salt. Or from the noun clothes, the derivative means without much clothes or almost without clothes. So there is some nuance of degree, and I'm not sure this can be called curative or typical curative. Okay. In some languages, there is both. There are both a neutral curative suffix, like in Bagwalal tub, which we saw before, and this kind of suffix having not so much of something. In this case, we can say that one suffix is curative, another is not curative, but in languages like Avar, it is not so clear whether we deal with something which is not curative or something which is simply more general and subsumes both curative and something related to the degree. Okay, I think I'll spend a couple of minutes from the discussion, and I will tell you now about phrasal curative markers. This is an interesting type. Phrasal markers are not heads of verb phrases. They are not affixes which attach to stems. Phrasal markers are hosted by noun phrases. And an example of such a marker is a curative particle t in andi, which is probably etymologically related to this derivational suffix tu we saw in Bagwalal. And it has adverbial curative phrases, and it normally bears an adverbializing marker gu. So some examples here. We cannot do anything without our soldiers. So without our soldiers is literally our soldiers. Soldatol is the absolutive plural. This is a normal absolutive case form. And we have the curative marker tigu in the end. In 25, without a single fellow man or without a companion, we see that tigu even follows a noun phrase which hosts an additive clitic without even a man. Yes, so we can see clearly here that tigu doesn't attach to a stem, but it follows an inflected noun. It follows a noun phrase, and sometimes it can even follow another clitic. And in 26, we see that tigu, when attached, when hosted by a noun phrase, doesn't have to be hosted by the head, because here, without any harm for you, it literally says, well, nothing harm for you without. Yes, so we see here that tigu is on the right edge of the noun phrase. It is not hosted by zaral, by the head of this noun phrase, harm. So I think these examples show clearly that tigu is not a suffix. It is a phrase level marker which occurs on the right edge of a noun phrase. And there is an asymmetry. We saw, for example, in Avar, a symmetry between attributive and adverbial curative phrases. We had participles and we had converbs. Here we have participles in attributive phrases, like in 27, mercy, not having father with the negative participle, with the participle of the negative copula. In adverbial clauses, we have this marker tigu, which is not related to the negative copula. Okay, there is also a problem with this type. In principle, it is very rare. However, if you recall what I said about converbs treated as postpositions, of course, these postpositions could be also subsumed under the phrasal type if we describe them as such, not as clausal constructions. However, sometimes there is a problem whether a certain marker should be treated as a derivational suffix or as a phrasal particle. This is the problem with the UD marker sus or nut, which we saw earlier, because it doesn't attach to, with nouns, it is attached to the bare stem. It is identical to the absolutive singular, but we cannot be sure whether this is really the absolutive noun phrase or just a bare stem. And for example, we have sentences like that. He opened the can without a knife. Is this mesuz without knife? Well, a suffixally derived adverb from the direct stem knife, or is it a combination of a noun phrase knife with some particle sus? I'm not sure. The situation is even worse, because with pronouns, the marker is attached to the oblique stem. However, at the same time, it can be attached to the plural form of the noun. Like in the end, you see the example. Without children, ailuch is the absolutive plural form. In principle, this is not something that derivational suffixes can do, to be attached to the plural form. So this is something that has to be investigated more. I think that's it. In the end, I just show you a summarizing table showing that there may be more than one type present in one language, but some examples are problematic and their status is not always clear. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Timur. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Natasha, you had a question.
Okay, that was, first of all, I would like to thank you for the talk. It was very clear and detailed. I had a question concerning slide 8. So that was the case of existential, just possession and how it is expressed, because you have these verbs which are glossed as be, and then you have it like translated with to have in your translation lines here. So are there any arguments in that show us that it is actually the verb to be or the copula or something like this? And how do you understand that it is actually the possession, just because there is a certain construction with it?
Yes, this is these verbs are used in normal predicative possession constructions, like I have 2 children, for example. Then the possessor will be with the verb ha, the possessor will be in the possessive case, like zak, something like at me, there are 2 children. But of course, these verbs are originally locative verbs.
Now I see, sorry.
They are not restricted to possessive contexts. They can be used in purely locative contexts, like, I don't know, there is a bag near the wall or something like that.
So there is the certain locational prefix part and the verb to be, right? Which grammaticalized in this, or
yes. The stem of this, the stem of this verb is to be. This is a defect.
So it's some kind of locational predicate.
Yes, this is a morphologically deficient predicate. Well, it is not a copula, strictly speaking. This is a morphologically deficient stative predicate be, which is used with different locative prefixes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, Marine.
Thank you. Okay, so this question of mine might be sort of trivial, but I would like to know something about the terminology that is being used here. And this is a much broader question, actually. First, let me mention some English uses of prepositions. So we have sort of like a sentence like, I came with a man, and we call this construction comitative. Then we have, I sliced a cake with a knife, and we call this instrumental, even if English doesn't have morphological cases. But here we had examples of these languages like Ghoul and Lesbian, where we have that carative expression. And in some instances, what is missing is the human referent, and in some instances, it is an object or an instrument. But we don't seem to make these terminological distinctions between something like de-comitative or de-instrumental, or is there such a thing in the wider terminology?
You mean, we want to know whether there is a distinction between caritives with, for example, with human reference?
Sure, they may be expressed by the same means in a particular language, but we may still want to call them differently, just for the ease of exposition in, for example, an article or something.
As far as I know, for both situations which you mentioned, I mean, companion and instrument,
yeah,
at least in these languages, one and the same means is employed. So we don't have to distinguish them formally here.
Yes. We don't have to for this particular example, and maybe not even for any example. But I mean, maybe I'm speaking as a terminologist here, but I would like to use these separate terms, even though they are expressed by the same means morphologically. Maybe
Okay.
I'm nitpicking here.
Thank you for the comment.